is Marxism Lindy, or is Marxism's optimism Lindy, would be the third question.
Okay, so is Marxism Lindy? I don't even know if Lindy's a thing. I mean, like, I don't, if you told me this airplane is Lindy, I would like to request a different airplane. If you tell me I would like to sell you this car for a high price because this car is Lindy, I will be like, I would like a new car, please. You know, if you're like, I would, you know, I think we should have a king because monarchy is Lindy, you know, like in 1910, I would be like, no, I would not like a king now. That is not Lindy. I would not like a Lindy thing. So I don't yeah, like memes stick around, spandrels stick around. Stephen Jay Gould. Spandrels stick around without, you know, with no evolutionary reason to you know, so I don't know. But then but by now I've forgotten the previous question.
Why is contemporary Marxism so popular in education and the arts? Like, is it unparalleled? I'm asking.
Oh.
The second one is, what is the actual ideological opposite of Marxism? Is it accelerationism?
Oh, right. I remember that one. Right.
And the third
There's
one
no,
is yeah.
right. There's no ideological opposite of Marxism. Ideologies don't have opposites. Like, what's the opposite of Christianity? I don't know. But is it Islam? Is it atheism? Is it, like, you know, Satanism? I don't know. But these ideologies don't have opposites. They're not like a pole, right? There's just like different things pointing in different directions, and sometimes they bump up against each other and work at cross purposes. But then, as to why it's so important, I think there is one reason. The United States after World War II created a university system in which you know, that we modeled everything off of the physical sciences. We modeled everything off of how physics, chemistry, and biology work. And economics works like this. You have peer review, you have journals, you have, you know, like, you have to publish certain numbers of journal papers, blah blah blah. Citation counts are the important things. We made this system. It works very well for some things. For the humanities, it just does not. This does not work. This is a shitty model. This is not a good way of determining who has created good humanities stuff. But yet we still use it because we use this one size fits all sort of thing to determine. And it became crucial to the academic system, but at the same time, it you know, because it became the way we do academia, it became the way that we allocate intellectual respect, because those are very closely connected in American society. Universities determine who gets the intellectual respect, and to some, I mean, you know, to some degree elsewhere as well. But then this university hierarchy was very important. And so earlier I talked about how Marxism was a way for people in fields like economics to get around the existing intellectual hierarchy and find a backdoor to intellectual respect. But also for fields, it's a way that you can ape the scientism of science. It's a way you can create scientism to ape the conventions and the stylings of science itself, of natural science, physical science. Like, you know, you have like these, you know, you can see this in the humanities, definitely not restricted to Marxism. But basically, instead of you know, instead of my experiment came out right, it's just like, my textual interpretation is correct. You know, or like, it's argument from authority replacing argument from experiment. Those obviously aren't the same thing. They shouldn't be treated the same, and we messed up by treating the humanities this way. And the humanities people are desperate that they'll lose prestige if they lose the physics imitation format, right? If they stop publishing and citing and doing all the things that physicists do, or that, you know, chemists do, or whatever,
like replicating your humanities findings.
Right. People will think you're just a word cell, as my friend Rune would say. You're just you know, you're just this idiot who just talks and talks and talks. You're dumb. You're low IQ. No one should listen to you. Just, you know, do the math. Shut up and learn to code. And that's the fear among humanities people. And the idea is that unless they ape the conventions of scientism, you know, unless they just ape the physics format, then they'll lose intellectual prestige and respect for working on these things. And so instead, I think that a lot of these arguments from authority, you see this in philosophy, like, you know, instead of thinking like, what is a good life? How should I live my life? You instead think, what does Kant say? You have to go through Kant. Who the fuck is Kant? I read that when I was 13. I was like, this is dumb. You just took 500 words to say something that could have been said in an equally dumb, wrong way in 10 words. Shut up, Kant. But he was dead, so I couldn't tell him that. And so then instead, I just read Hume instead, and I was a fan of Hume. But but the point is that you have to go through these old philosophers. Who are these old guys? And now you see this. Interestingly, you see a rebellion in America with throwing out like the old dead white men. It's identity-based attack on the old philosophers. I think what people really don't want is just to have to go through these fucking gatekeepers of guys who lived in a completely different context. Like, think about when Kant lived. Like Kant didn't even have a goddamn light bulb. Like he did never seen a light. He lived and died without turning on a light switch. Like, why should that guy say anything? And of course the same is true of Marx. But then the idea is you have to go through the old gatekeepers. And I feel like a lot of for some people, Marxism is a way of just it's one sort of set of ancient wise gatekeepers you can pull out, but it's far from unique. It's far from the only such set. Kantians or like philosophy. If you like make people learn about Kant, that's not Marx, but it's a similar sort of intellectual gatekeeping exercise. And I think that in America, all of this is to ape the academic conventions of physics, so that you can look smart, so that you can get money, so that you can be an academic and you can live that life. Blah 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 blah. But now that we're cracking down on professors sleeping with students, perhaps the academic life will become less attractive for people, and people will stop doing this as much. Well, maybe not.
I'd like to just insert as somebody who read continental philosophy for 5 years, the first 3 of which I was clinically depressed because I thought I was really dumb because I didn't understand anything. And then the last 2 years of it, I just realized that no, I don't understand it because it doesn't make any sense. But right. There are some things where you have to go back to the old texts, whether that's Hume or the Talmud or Rumi, whatever works for you, to kind of see how nothing changes and what is the human condition. There is a beauty to that, but it's not something that you will replicate in a lab. You replicate it by reading a lot and seeing that there are these recurring themes in music, in literature, in philosophy, just as in defense of the humanities. Maybe it's sunk cost fallacy on my end.
Yeah. All right. So I've just been very insulting and made fun of a lot of people who aren't here to defend themselves. So
this salon is a subtweet. I love it. This salon is a subtweet. Sorry, Robert.
I think we'd love to have Kant here to defend himself, but I'm afraid it won't happen.
He's dead.
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, if
you're dead, Kant.
He had a lot of.
If he were here, that would be something.
Yeah.
But now let's give the floor to Jason because he has his hand up for a long while.
If Jason now defends continental philosophy, I will send him a cake.
No, I don't think I'm going to do that. Yeah, so sorry. So my initial thoughts were kind of spurred by something from a while ago, but so I'll just say kind of a thing out there, and hopefully it'll be relevant to at least some of what's been said recently. So I think when we think about kind of why movements take off and have appeal, Noah outlined some of the reasons why maybe people were interested in Marx in the 19th century and why people are interested in wokeism today. But I think also kind of what happens with the things that happens with social movements is like, so in a certain sense, they're sparked by certain like grievances that people have perhaps, or maybe on the positive side, opportunities that they see, but often it's like a complaint they have about the world and something they want to fix or make better. But then also every social movement brings its own kind of whole like philosophy to interpret the grievances and sort of diagnose them and prescribe a solution. And so I think you also have to kind of look at like, what is the metaphysics and epistemology that people are bringing to bear on the problem? What are the tools that they're using to understand what the problem is, right? And so like in Marx, as I understand it, so like I said, my understanding is Marx was kind of influenced by Hegel. Hegel had this notion that like as history evolves, each era has, somebody correct me if you know Hegel and better than I do and I'm getting this wrong, but like each era has kind of its own logic and the logic of each era is maybe incompatible. And so, you can't necessarily like have a logical conversation across the centuries. And then Marx came along and sort of took a similar idea, but fragmented it more economically. So like each class has its own logic. And literally like the classes couldn't just have like a reasonable discussion because they literally have different logics and different like whole different epistemologies based on your like material class. And then in the post, and that was part of him interpreting like class struggle and economic inequality and stuff. And then if you want to look at kind of the woke movement, I think you have to understand it in the context of postmodernism, which, as I understand it, is sort of saying like, look, there actually isn't any logic or truth. There's really only power struggles at the end of the day. And so then everything kind of gets reframed in terms of like, power struggles where essentially the powerful get to determine what is sort of socially accepted as truth. And that I think frames a lot of, like you can come to, you can start out with grievances around, racism and sexism. But then I think the only way to understand kind of the woke movement is to then interpret those grievances through this lens or context of postmodern metaphysics and epistemology.
Thank you. Ryan has also his hand up, also for a long while. So the floor is yours now.
Hey there, hopefully everyone can hear me. And yeah, great to be here. Just wanted to go back to a point you made, Noah, around wokeism being, I think it was Marxism, but for respect, or communism for respect, which was really interesting. But my question centers more around, well, why is it arised now? Like what happens in culture or society or history that causes this to arise? Because wokeism is, or what we've experienced for the past few years, is very unique. We didn't have anything like this, 2 decades ago. Is there something that has to arise in society, a set of conditions that allow something as strong as this to arise, whether it's, more recently with wokeism or at some point in the last century with, Marxism or 20th century Marxism? What is the precursor, if there is one, to it arising so intensely in certain periods of time, in certain ways?
So instead of discussing Marxism, you want me to be Marx and say, here's why history will inevitably lead to this conflict.
Yes.
Sure, I can do that. Why not? And then yeah, I'll write some book that's so dense that people can get lots of citation counts for arguing about interpretations of it, and then 200 years later or whatever, people will be publishing papers saying, what did Noah Smith really mean? Why? What did the rabbits mean? Was it a symbolism for something? The rabbit, by the way, that there is the rabbits actually do have a deep symbolism about my worldview, but that's for another day. So and it is similar to Marxism, but that's for another day. As for what Jason said about POMO, sort of postmodernism, maybe so. There, if you look at where the intellectual roots of wokeness came from, they came from most of them did not come from European leftism. Most of them came from basically Black people, but also Protestantism. Wokeness is very Protestant in its ideas and stylings and morality and blah blah blah. A million people have noticed this, like especially people who go to church, Protestant church in America. Wokeness is extremely Protestant, and it was, the last time too. The Congregationalist movement did, was the powerhouse behind abolitionism. And so all these white churches would get Black preachers to come here and preach to them. And they started preaching abolitionism as the holy mission, which is written into the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which our Marines still use as their theme song. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. His truth is marching on. That's Battle Hymn of the Republic. And so, and that came from Congregationalism, came from Protestantism, Methodism. Yep. Like all the Protestants in those days were pretty woke. Except, of course, the Southern Baptists, who split off because they supported slavery and to this day they're pretty conservative. But anyway, you know, that's where wokeness comes from. And then if you look at the seminal authors of wokeness, they were all Black people in the 70s. You know, like they were all yeah, like you know, Audre Lorde and people like that. These were the people who wrote the stuff that would become wokeness. And they took some from anarchism. Actually, I'd say wokeness takes more from anarchism, much more from anarchism than from Marxism, or from, you know, Pomo stuff. And I think Pomo was more about the academic credentialism, about like making stuff so fucking incomprehensible that like you could get a bunch of citations out of it and make sort of throw up a barrier to entry so people couldn't like, you know, take your intellectual respect without going through your gatekeeping and stuff. So Pomo, you know, it was famously dense. You know, you'd write these like big Derrida style like treatises that nobody understood, and that people could then argue about in this sort of the self-perpetuating string of textual interpretations where you wrote something incomprehensible about some other incomprehensible bullshit someone else wrote about. So postmodernism had a lot of bullshit in it. And, you know, usually to make very, very, very simple points with incredibly obtuse language. And then you notice the woke people just started tossing that all out, tossing all the Pomo stuff out. So instead of you know, some like long Derrida style treatise on whatever bullshit, how everything's just a reference to some other thing, instead they'd be like, you know, they'd instead of writing 400 pages of that, they'd just write like Black Lives Matter 1,000 times, right? And so it was that's religious, that's a catechism, that is a, you know, like a religious mantra or whatever that you want to call it, that you repeat. And so it was very religious in a way that Pomo never was. Pomo was like academic headassery taken to extreme impossible levels, while wokeness has democratized it so that street organizers and random Twitter users and Facebook posters can be the intellectual equivalents of a professor. And in fact, many of the cancellations that you see in the woke attacks are against old lefty Pomo professors within the academy. And that's been a huge source of cancellation. So, you know, my friends who were humanities grad students said the main social dynamic was students basically trying to cancel their old white, you know, Pomo spouting professors. And so that's, you know, that's a little bit of that. So in terms of me becoming, you know, Marx here and saying why in history, why did the forces of history inevitably lead to this blah, blah, blah? Why wokeness now? Well, I think that one reason is just because this reemerges in America every like half century or so. There's just this very, you know, it's just it's always bubbling up. You know, we had 70s wokeness, 60s 70s wokeness, and then we had and there was like some wokeness in like the like 20s, and then you know, of course Civil War. But then so this, you know, when we called it radical republicanism, basically during and just after the Civil War, and you had all these people who were like, you know, we must have open borders for Chinese immigration. That was a big like, you know, progressive or radical Republican cause. And so why did wokeness happen now? I would say that if there's any reason, it's simply because of increasing diversity, because you know, our country shifted from being a 90% white country to a, you know, 60% white country very quickly. And so all the people in the positions of power, you know, within like the, you know, corporate CEOs or full professors at universities or administrators or media executives, or all these people occupying the top of our hierarchies were all like white guys, because that's what we had before, you know, women, you know, women also. So women are the other thing. It's like, so women joined the workforce en masse in the, starting in the 70s, but really in the 80s. And then starting in the 90s, women started getting promoted up the chain, and started becoming management and executives and blah, blah, blah. And so you had the, you know, back in like the early 1970s, it was all the people at the top were just white men, all. And then, you know, and they probably had an affinity for other white men, you know, in terms of promotion and who they thought was like a smart young person who I'm going to promote and blah, 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 even though that wasn't really accurate, just because of cultural and personal affinity. You know, like people tend to promote and favor people who are like them, but the actual pool of white men in the workforce was shrinking. And so I think there was some unfairness in who was getting promoted up through the hierarchies within corporations and academia and government and, you know, just NGOs and all of our hierarchies in our society. There was this mismatch between the pool of talent, right, and the people who were getting promoted. And I think that was a big source of resentment. And also just media had failed to reckon with that. And so I think that a lot of what you see, you know, a lot of wokeness involves fights for representation, because I think you just, you know, like put Asian people in the movies. You didn't really see Asian people in the movies. Occasionally you saw an Asian person on TV, usually written as sort of a schmucky, jerky character by like, you know, white writers who just weren't thinking too carefully about it when they wrote it. And so then you got this whole thing with like people yelling like put Asians in the movies, and then we got Asians in the movies. And so that was the thing. You had so I think that was one part. The other part of why wokeness happened now was social media, because that democratized the information space, and suddenly you could get a whole bunch of people to yell at your boss. So suppose that your boss is an asshole to you. Well, in like 2005, you sucked it up, right? Because what are you going to do? Go sue? You're going to go to the courts? Who's gonna protect you against against your asshole boss? Or maybe the boss is actually nice and you're just a sort of a grasping, person who wants to overthrow their boss. But either way, who are you going to turn to for help against your boss? Now you turn to Twitter. You go to Twitter and you launch a thing and you say, hey guys, this boss is sexist, this boss is racist, this boss is blah, 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 privileged and insensitive and whatever, right? And then you get a whole bunch of random people who are just bored and frustrated and just like feeling in a shitty mood, go like, yeah, I'll click retweet on that, I'll click like on that, whatever. And then it has this massive feeling of mob, and the boss is like, oh my God, social media pressure, oh God. And so they have to make these concessions. And so it became this way to exert power, to recruit people to sentiment from outside, just regular people, to form flash mobs, to attack anyone in the hierarchy above you that you didn't like. And this, even beyond the actual flash mobs, the ever-present fear of these flash mobs, made a lot of bosses preemptively look for people to make concessions to, so they wouldn't get mobbed, so they wouldn't be next. And so that is cancel culture. Cancel culture is similar to something in Japan called gekokujo, where in the 1930s, young super right-wing, ultra-nationalist, fascist army officers wanted to overthrow both their own superior officers and the political and economic elite of the country. And they got support from the general populace, the restive general populace, to do this. And so the young army officers would do coup attempts, murders, assassinations, all kinds of shit, start wars. They started wars with China. They would start all these wars and they would do assassinations and coup attempts and stuff, and they would get off scot-free because the people as a whole sort of would support them. And then if they were, the leadership was so scared that if they punished these guys harshly, there would be massive riots and stuff. And so they got this, so the junior army officers started ruling the roost, and the senior army officers were scared of them. And this was called gekokujo, which means low overcoming high. And that was the name in Japan. And I recognize something very similar with what Twitter, and to a lesser extent other social media sites, allow people to do, to attack the people who are above them in the American status hierarchies, within organizational hierarchies. You can always, whoever your superior is in the organization, Twitter is always more powerful. And you can always go to Twitter and raise a hue and cry against those people. And so I think that's the other reason wokeness emerged, is because you can do this. So, and suddenly we have a technology that allows you to do this. You couldn't do this before. And so when, I think a lot of tech nerds around in the 90s and 2000s really wanted to upset and overturn the hierarchies of society, right? They were rebellious. They were techno-libertarians or techno-socialists, or just rebels and punks, who didn't like the cosseted status hierarchies, and who went, instead of going to Wall Street or investment banks or just going to corporate America, they went out and started coding in a warehouse in Oakland or whatever, or just a loft in San Francisco, whatever, so that they could, like Jack Dorsey, he did that, so they could upset those status hierarchies, and they did. And guess what happens when you upset status hierarchies? Revolution. And then the revolution came for them. And the revolution always comes for the people who start the revolution. That's the rule of revolution. It happens every time. Eric Hoffer has an amazing book about this called The True Believer. And everyone should read Eric Hoffer's book. If you want to, yeah. So then, and he just talks about how basically everyone who joins these movements, who starts these movements, ends up getting canceled by the movements. you know, how they like all the French Revolution, like all the liberal intellectuals, like the radical revolutionaries came for them. It will happen. And so when you choose to unleash that, realize that you won't be there for the culmination, and that it will go too far and get reversed. And so that's sort of every process of social change. But you need social change. And Hoffer points this out too. Without without these upheavals, periodic upheavals, you don't get real change. Change doesn't happen very steadily and incrementally. The social changes we need, instead, they happen with messy upheavals that go too far and make a lot of mistakes.
I have a kind of follow-up on this, but first I turn to Hamish because he also has a question or comment.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I would agree, Noah, in that the reason it keeps happening in an expanding way is because voices expanded. The ability of people to speak to higher authority has expanded as technology has progressed over time. And the history of Marxism in the 19th century did end up in trades unionism. And that was because that was the only way for people to be heard. So you had to ally amongst your own group. And that's where Marx's speaking of class did really resound with people, because people in industrial revolutions became identified with the town they'd gone to work in and the factories and the industries they were in. And so it was the steel workers unite, or it was the dock workers unite. That made a lot of sense. It was the only way for those people to have a voice on any issues, on health and safety, on labor, on hiring practices, on social issues in that area. It was the only way they could get heard. They couldn't get heard in the media. You know, the media was owned by people who weren't interested in their voice. And then it kept developing, as you said. Then you had the suffragette movements, and then you had the liberal movements in the post-war settlements, you know, where peace and new technologies allowed those movements to flourish. And then those people were trying to overthrow the power structures that they saw. So I think you're absolutely right, Noah. My point I wanted to make was that hopefully we can discuss a bit more, is that people asking about why Marxism is proven so so able to infect other fields is because there's a difference between Marxism and a Marxist critique. And a Marxist critique is simply, as Noah said, applying the lens of classes to everything. So a Marxist critique is look at whatever you're upset about, try and identify a proletariat who are ruled by some kind of bourgeoisie, and then identify what could come about so that the proletariat can overthrow what should happen, right? So look at history, see why it came about that way, and then decide what should happen to overthrow. And you can do that in anything. Any organization can. So Marxist critique is a permanent way of analyzing a situation, a society, an epoch, and that's a bit different to what Marxism was and became, and what Marxism led to. But it's why Marxism, when it gets mixed up, it's why Marxism is so often applied to these fields. Is because actually people are applying. They might not know it, but they're applying a Marxist critique to something, and that's what they're doing, or you could say that they're doing. And it's very useful to look at organizations or societies in that way, as a lens.
Laura, would you like to reflect on this? Yep. Go ahead. I just wanted to ask whether you want to reflect on this.
Me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I mean, yeah. I mean, like, you know, Marxism isn't just a set of ideas; it's also an intellectual style, right?
Any other notes? Something that surprised you in this conversation? Something that you want to like read up on now? Angry DMs you want to send Noah? Fan mail you want to send Noah? Share it here.
I definitely very much like the notion of considering Marxism as a religion, and I do know some people from the academia for whom, yes, it is indeed a religion. So I never thought about that before, but yeah, it's definitely true.
Europe's traditional religion, perhaps.
It depends where you go. So yeah, not necessarily in Hungary, or I would say there are fewer in Hungary who follow this religion, even in the academia. All right. Thank you so much again for being with us and for this exciting conversation. I also learned a lot today too. And thanks again for Noah for joining us today. And I
was like,
much
I'm not an expert, and then just shared this kind of encyclopedia of knowledge. I loved it.
And I really hope that you will join us next time. We'll meet, I think, on the first Saturday of November, as far as I can remember. And then we'll talk about fascism. Okay,
Thank you so
then
much.
have fun
Take
this
care.
weekend.
Bye-bye.
Yep.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye.